Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to this third and final installment in what has been a truly fascinating journey through the birth, anatomy, life, and now death of the Titanic. I've learned a huge amount about this liner that we think we know a lot about, but actually, in retrospect, we only really know about its disastrous end. That's Bruce Ismay, escaping in one of the last lifeboats as portrayed in A Night to Remember, a film. So, this is stills from that film. A letter here is written by the Reverend John Harper on the 2nd of April, informing friends that his passage on the Lusitania had been cancelled. The crucial part of the letter reads, I am to be in Walworth, God willing. After all this weekend, I received the instructions this morning that my steamer, the Lusitania, cannot sail on Saturday, and as the steamer that goes in her place is a slow one, I have decided to wait till next Wednesday. So next Wednesday was Titanic's sailing day. His decision sadly proved fatal, as he would go down with the ship. So as the Titanic sped through the darkness towards its doom, the majority of the passengers and crew hadn't the slightest inkling that they were in any danger at all. The lowering temperatures drove the passengers from the promenade decks into the warmth of the saloons and cabins. Many joined together to form their own groups and parties at dinner, one included the captain, and afterwards dispersed in the smoke rooms. The Reverend E. C. Carter had organised a hymn service in the second-class dining room, attended by 100 passengers, that lasted from 8 till 10, and by 11:30 p.m, just before the impact, most of the passengers followed the captain's example and retired to bed, leaving only a few stalwarts finishing their nightcaps and smoking a last cigar in the almost deserted smoking rooms and lounges. On the bridge, the calm routine of the night was shattered by the warning bell from the crow's nest and Fleet's dramatic telephone call. Although Officer Moody didn't forget his manners, he thanked the lookout for his report before calling across the first officer Murdoch, iceberg right ahead. Murdoch's reactions were creditably instantaneous. Leaping forward, he grabbed at the handles of the engine's telegraph and rang down stop, followed by full astern. At the same time, he ordered the helmsman, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, to turn the wheel hard to starboard. The order was obeyed promptly. Hitchens spun the wheel as far as it would go, causing the ship to begin swinging to port. The apparent discrepancy between the helm order and the direction of the turn results in the system of orders in common use at the time that dated back to the days when ships were steered by a tiller. Pushing it to starboard returned in a turn to port, and vice versa. This system survived until the more logical current system made standard in 1928. As the ship turned, Murdoch pressed the bell switch, warned all in the lower compartments that the watertight doors were about to close automatically, holding it down for 10 seconds before operating the lever to actuate the closure. So despite the prompt reaction by all involved, the ship only veered some 20 degrees to port when the fateful collision occurred. The interval between the first sighting and the impact was estimated to have been a little over 30 seconds. Wow, so instantaneous. Only enough time for the ship to cover some 500 yards, far too short to allow any successful avoiding action. Although a head-on collision had been averted, the starboard side of the Titanic's hull crashed into the great mass of solid ice, which then scraped relentlessly along the brittle underwater plating, leaving a trail of damage about 300 feet long. In some places it gashed open the hull to a width of a few inches, and in some places the hole was probably as little as half an inch wide, but that was enough. On the bridge, 4th Officer Boxall arrived on the bridge just as the collision occurred, having been due to take over watch 5 minutes later. Almost immediately he was joined by the captain. What have we struck? He asked the first officer anxiously. Murdoch quickly made his report, confirming that they'd hit an iceberg, and detailing the actions they had taken. Both officers strode out onto the bridge wing to look aft for the iceberg, and on re-entering the bridge the captain told Boxall to inspect the forward area of the hull below decks, and to report back as soon as possible. He moved the engine telegraphs to half ahead, but then then ran down stop. Shortly afterwards, the Titanic slowed and then stopped dead in the water. While the deck officers were uncertain as to the extent of the damage, if any, some of these stokers, firemen, trimmers and engineers unfortunate enough to have been on duty in the machinery spaces at the time had no doubts as to the seriousness of the situation. The forward boiler room number 6, only 2 stokers and an engineer got out before the water began to rise and the watertight doors were closed. However, in the engine room further aft, the collision was only felt as a bump or a jar, although the noise of the ice crab scraping along it was heard. Fourth Officer Boxall made a quick tour of inspection in the forward hull, discovered that the orlop deck was flooded forward of number 4 watertight bulkhead, and although he saw no water on F deck, he was informed by the postal clerks that the water was rising in the post office below. Returning quickly to the bridge, he informed the captain of his findings, and was then ordered to establish the ship's position so it could be included in any subsequent wireless messages. Boxall pored over the charts and calculated a dead reckoning position based on his own stellar observation at 7:30, updated with the ship's subsequent course and estimate of its speed. He quickly reported that the Titanic laid stop at 41:46 north, 50:14 west, a position that became enshrined in maritime law, but was subsequently proved to be incorrect by a few vital miles, causing misunderstanding and controversy for decades afterwards. This is still from the film Titanic, showing the tender taking passengers to the Titanic from Cherbourg. It's interesting, I think this book would have been published or made well before 1997, so of course it doesn't have a more slightly modern version of it to reference. Here's the film's radio operator sending out the distress signal that was picked up over 50 miles away by the Carpathia that steamed over to rescue survivors from the ICC. The real wireless room is here, from which Harold Bride sent out the distress signal. Captain Smith went to see things for himself and was accompanied by Thomas Andrews, the Harland and Wolff managing director. Probably knew as much about anybody about the ship and her construction. The latter did not take long to reach the unpalatable conclusion that the ship was mortally damaged, and estimated that it would sink in an hour and a half or 2 hours on the outside, a remarkably accurate assessment in the circumstances, and only one can guess about how both men must have felt as the realization dawned upon them. I mean, I can imagine you'd feel absolutely sick to your stomach. The main problem was that number 6 boiler room was holed, and that all the bow watertight compartments were holed or filling, so it was only a matter of time before the bow sank low enough for water to lap over the top of the next watertight bulkhead. When this happened, the ship would settle even lower in the water, other compartments would flood, and so on and so forth. On his return to the bridge, a grim-faced captain ordered the crew to be mustered, the lifeboats uncovered, and the radio operators to begin transmitting a distress message, which was first received at Cape Race and by at least 2 ships, Mount Temple and Provence, at 12:15 a.m. Armed with Boxall's new estimated position, accurate or not, the captain personally went to the radio room and ensured that it was included in all subsequent transmissions. Here we have another still from the film, where Captain Smith informs his mate, the White Star Line's director, that the ship is doomed. The message that was sent in Morse code took the form of the Titanic's calling code, MGY, then the letter CQ, that meant that it was addressed to all ships, followed by the letter D, indicating distress or danger. The resulting 3-letter group was often held to become quick danger, but in fact the letters had no significance other than as outlined above. In 1908, the famous SOS signal was introduced, which was easier to send in Morse code because it consisted of 3 dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots, but it still wasn't in common use in 1912. Later in the evening, Bride and Phillips started using the SOS code instead of CQD, one of the first times that it had been used in an emergency. So the officers and crew roused and assembled were ordered to inform passengers and directed them to assemble on the boat decks, which was really hard. There wasn't a tannoy or public address system. Stewards and crew had to go around all the cabins, waking everyone, telling them to put on life jackets, find their way up to the boat deck. This wasn't made any easier by the cacophony of the noise on the upper decks, which was being caused by steam escaping through safety valves as the main engines were closed down. noise was also causing problems for the radio operators in their cabin. They could barely hear the high-pitched Morse signals being transmitted. Most passengers at first weren't concerned, refusing to believe that such a fine ship could be in any imminent danger. Many first-class passengers formed an orderly queue at the purser's office on sea deck, where they withdrew jewellery, other valuable items. Others took no immediate action to dress themselves in warm clothing or find their life jackets, assuming everything would be alright in the end. Those passengers who did heed the warnings slowly made their way up to the boat deck, formed patient groups waiting to embark, and in the meantime the ship's musicians, led by Lancashireman Wallace Hartley, assembled in the first-class lounge on A deck, began playing a succession of popular ragtime tunes. Although intended to help calm the passengers, their actions perhaps succeeded too well, as the melody sounding out into the chill night air lent an unreality to the whole proceedings. Chief Officer Wilde ordered the second officer to prepare the lifeboats. Light Tyler made a round of the boat deck. He had difficulty with the noise too. I don't think that's often conveyed. That wasn't really conveyed in the films. He checked boats 4, 6 and 8, then 10, 12, 14, 16, and then to 15, 13, 11 and 9, before back to 7, 5 and 3. Boats 1 and 2, the emergency cutters, were already swung out, and work began to prepare the collapsible Engelhart boats for use if required. Captain Smith accepted that his ship was lost and that the lifeboat evacuation was the only remaining course. Realising that there were nowhere near enough lifeboat places for all on board, he ordered that only women and children should be loaded at first. Light-Dollar then ordered the lifeboats to be swung up personally supervised at the side. So progress was slow, partly due to the crew's unfamiliarity with the equipment and the drills to be used. They had been given virtually no training or exercise in skills up to the time of the sinking. In addition, the officers appeared not to have been briefed on the capacities of the boat, so many allowed them to be lowered only at half full under the mistaken impression that they could not be safely lowered when filled to capacity. Tragic error. Another problem was caused by the screens fitted to the forward section of the promenades of A deck, which prevented passengers boarding boats lowered from the boat deck above, as was originally intended, and there was some delay before the tool to undo the screen windows was found, and by which time some of the boats had already been lowered. As illustrated in the film A Night to Remember, families were separated through the women and children rule. Women reluctant to leave their husbands in the safety of the ship. Now that I have, of course, a wife and 2 young children, being put in this scenario rips the heart from my body. It is the pain that these individuals must have felt. Yes, it's the honourable thing to allow you to go stay first, but I'm a part of this family. We're a family unit, and it's breaking that apart. It's terrible, really terrible. So because of all of these problems, it wasn't until 12:45 that the first lifeboat was lowered into freezing water, number 7 from the port side, that was considerably less than half full, carrying 28 people against its capacity of 65, oh my word. So the occupants included 3 crewmen, 8 female and 10 male passengers. A reflection on the lack of urgency pertaining at that time, because male passengers would have only been allowed to have boarded if no women and children had been waiting. Then number 5, under the command of 3rd Officer Pittman, and came in, and although some 41 survivors were on board, it wasn't anywhere near full. The launch of the boat had been accompanied by some drama, as J. Bruce Ismay appeared and attempted to take charge, blustering out improbable orders to passengers and crew alike. He was put in his place by 5th Officer Lowe and disappeared out of sight. Pittman took charge of the 2 boats, and they rowed away from the ship and played an unedifying part in the drama, later refusing to return and pick up more survivors from the water as the ship sank. On a more amusing note, with hindsight, one of the women passengers suffered 2 broken ribs when Dr. H. Frantal and his brother, observing that the boat, which had already contained his wife, also had many empty berths, leapt into it as it was being lowered, and landed heavily on the unfortunate Mrs. Annie Stengel. despite this unfortunate incident, all happily survived to tell the tale. I don't know if that's that amusing, to be honest. I think the author has a slightly perverse sense of humour. On the port side, Lightoller finally managed to get lifeboat number 6 away at around 12:55 with about 28 people on board. It's quite difficult to ascertain actual numbers because it's all based on witnesses' accounts. No official count was made. So all of these were women, apart from 2 crew members and 2 male passengers, one of whom was Major Arthur Pochin, an amateur yachtsman who'd volunteered to assist in the handling of the boat. In the end, the crew members proved to be of little use. It was left to the women to do most of the rowing. Significantly, as the boat was about to be lowered, Captain Smith ordered Quartermaster Hitchens, who was in charge of the boat, to make for another ship whose lights could be seen some 5 miles away off the Titanic's starboard bow. This was the first of many sightings of one, possibly more, unidentified vessels in the vicinity, and whose existence, or otherwise, became the subject of much speculation and investigation in the aftermath of the sinking. So various reasons, partly because Murdoch was slightly less strict about the interpretation of the women and children first order, and also because of difficulties caused by the fact that the ship was listing slightly to starboard, these boats got away quickly. Next was number 3, contained around 50 people, including many male passengers and approximately 15 crew, as apparently there were no more women and children in the vicinity when it was ready to be lowered. An attempt was made to load more passengers from A deck as it was lowered, but this was frustrated by the locked windows of the promenade screens. The 3 full-size forward starboard lifeboats away, Murdoch and Lowe moved forward and attempted to launch the number 1 cutter. This was achieved with some difficulty. It didn't enter the water until 1:10 a.m. and only carried a dozen people, despite having a capacity of 40. The occupants were mostly crew, but also included Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon and their secretary. Sir Cosmo subsequently achieved some notoriety, as there's no doubt that he actually paid the crew members £5 each, although the reason for doing so was hotly debated. Some alleged that he bribed the men to row away from the ship, ignoring other survivors' cries for help, so that it wouldn't be overloaded or dragged down when the ship sank, which he stoutly maintained that the payment was in gratitude for the crew's assistance and to cover the costs of their personal losses. Whatever the truth of either version, it's a typical story of many personal dramas that makes it so fascinating. The seaman in charge of the boat, George Simmons, was also one of many witnesses who reported seeing the lights of another ship, started to head towards it, but he reported it being on the port bow. Interesting. I never knew of there being potentially a ship in the vicinity that may have ignored them and just trawled off, or could it have been a trick of the mind, perhaps trick of the light? Could they have been reflected or refracted lights of the Titanic itself in the distance? Who knows? This is the Olympics Bridge, which was identical to the Titanic's. That's quite sparse, doesn't it? Here's a young Jack Odell gazing out over the Titanic side, and here's the poop deck with the docking bridge. This is where people gathered when it sank. So, on the other side, Chief Officer Wilde joined Lightoller, and they succeeded in getting lifeboat number 8 away with around 4 crewmen and 35 women aboard. Captain Smith again instructed the crew to row for a ship whose lights he thought he could see in the distance. But before the boats were lowered, another little drama was played out when Mrs. Ida Strauss refused to leave her husband, who, despite urgings to the contrary by other passengers and crew, in view of his old age, refused all offers to be allowed to break the women and children first rule. This brave but needless stance resulted in both being drowned when the ship finally sank. The undoubted hero, or more correctly heroine, of this boat was Lady Lucy Nor Martha, Countess of Rothes, who steadfastly took turns at rowing and steering, as well as comforting some of the other women who had lost their husbands. Back on the starboard side, Murdoch and Moody got boat number 9 away at around 1:20 a.m. with 56 people on board. The highest total so far had 8 crewmen and 6 passengers that were male. They also saw a light of a ship and attempted to row towards it, but with no success. Number 10 side, loaded with 4 crew members, 41 women and 7 children, together with 2 male passengers, who slipped aboard while the officers in charge of embarkation were distracted. So, as the urgency of the situation began to dawn on all concerned, the later boats tended to be filled to much nearer their nominal capacity. Boat 11, lowered away from the starboard side at around 1:25 a.m, was one of the most crowded, one estimate putting the total on board at 70, mostly women. Almost simultaneously, 12 was launched on the port side, but only included 40 women passengers and 2 crew, with several male passengers being denied access. With these 2 in the water, half of the available lifeboats had been launched, work continued apace to get the rest filled. Here we have, of course, the famous band, led by Wallace Hartley, playing until the very end, and all lost their lives. And here we have a third-class passenger set enjoying an impromptu concert in the third-class general room, both from a scene from A Night to Remember, an old film. So while most of the officers were busily engaged in supervising the preparation and lowering of the boats, 4th Officer Boxall remained on the bridge, was ordered by the captain to begin firing pyrotechnics known as socket signals to attract the attention of a vessel whose lights were seen by all on the bridge. Again, this seems to have not done anything. There were attempts to signal the vessel by means of the powerful Morse signal lamp, also met with no response. So if this vessel existed is one of the many mysteries of the night, but what is certain is that the distress signals were seen by another more distant vessel, the Californian, that lay stopped in the ice field somewhere between 8 and 19 miles north of the Titanic. The actions of this ship and her commander, Captain Stanley Lord, became the centre of much controversy and speculation in the aftermath of the sinking. Lord was accused of virtually ignoring the drama supposedly unfolding before his very eyes. So while these scenes were being enacted on the bridge and boat decks, activity below was varied, and witness accounts became fragmented. But one particularly cool story is of a Colonel Gracie, who, on recognising Frederick Wright, the professional squash player, calmly requested that his booking for Monday be cancelled. In the third-class rooms, many of the Catholic Irish immigrants came together and recited their rosary as they awaited their fate. There were undoubted cases of both passengers and crew helping themselves to general brandy, but this was uncommon. Down below, though, events were quickly moving to seal the vessel's fate. In number 5 boiler room, a few firemen and engineers remained to man the pumps in an attempt to stop the compartment flooding. Suddenly, at around 12:45 a.m, the bulkheads between 5 and 6 boiler rooms gave way, and the whole compartment was flooded in seconds. Only one occupant, leading stoker Fred Barrett, managed to escape. All the others drowned. It was suggested that the collapsing bulkhead could have been damaged by the bunker fire that was burning when the ship left Belfast, which I still can't believe or wrap my head around. Up on deck, the boats were continuing to be filled. Boat number 14 is believed to have contained 63 people, all but 10 of them women, under the command of 5th Officer Lowe. And then once in the water, Lowe had the boat rowed away, gathered a number of other boats together, transferred most of the passengers out of his boat with the intention of rowing back and picking up more survivors. By the time he was ready to carry out the plan, there were few alive in the bitterly cold water to be rescued. Which is awful, isn't it? Think about how quickly that happened. How cold water just can steal the air from your lungs and that's it. On the starboard side, boats 13 and 15 launched one after another with 63 and 70 people respectively. As the first of these entered the water and drifted slightly sternwards while still attached, the second boat was almost lowered on top of it. Disaster was only averted when those seamen lowering the boat heard screams from below and stopped it. In fact, boat 15 was one of the few to carry significant numbers of third-class travellers, who had proportionately fewer than among first or second-class passengers. And subsequent inquiries looked into this and accepted that there were no physical obstacles to prevent third-class passengers accessing the boat decks, but it would have been difficult for many of them to have found their way around the unfamiliar parts of the ship, because of course they hadn't spent any of the time there, so all of a sudden they're now on a part of the ship they don't recognise. Here are some images from the film Atlantic. Desperate passengers struggling to escape. We have, even at the last, gamblers trying to distract themselves from their imminent death. obviously much easier for those passengers to reach the lifeboats, but there are many examples of crew members going below and making efforts to guide others up there. So by now the ship was well down by the boxer bows and had taken a slight list, and nevertheless Boat 16, the last of the standard lifeboats, was launched without trouble, carrying 56 passengers and crew. First Officer Murdoch then went forward and began to prepare Boat C, one of the collapsible boats for launching. Had a flattened bottom and a canvas side that could be raised and rigged to give a freeboard of around 3 feet. This wasn't without excitement. Murdoch had actually one stage fired his pistol into the air to hold back a group of men who tried to rush aboard. When it finally got away, estimates wildly varied in terms of whether or not it was 70 or the more generally accepted figure of 39, many of whom were women passengers from third class. The most controversial occupant was J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman, who subsequently stated that he stepped aboard only because there were no other passengers waiting in the vicinity, and other witnesses claimed that he pushed through a crowd of men in order to force himself aboard. Whatever the truth, the poor man was subsequently vilified by unsympathetic commentators who obviously thought that he should have followed the example of the captain and gone down with the ship, although what that would have achieved would be open to question. Boat 2, one of the emergency cutters launched at 1:45, was under the command of hard-working 4th Officer Boxall, who had the presence of mind to equip himself with some green signal rockets, so that subsequently he was the first boat to be located and picked up. There were only 26 in the cutter, and it was followed by Lifeboat 4, the last of the standard boats at 1:55. The launch of this had been one of the epics of the night. It was the first to be prepared, and had been lowered on light earler's instructions to aid dead level so that passengers could board, and unfortunately he'd forgotten about the lock screens, hauled it up again, lowered it back down, efforts made to undo the screens, and then while this was going on, a most orderly and genteel queue of first-class women passengers, together with their children and maids, waited patiently on the promenade. By the time it was ready for loading, the ship's list had carried it away from the side. A cable was used to put it aboard, and these were later joined by 4 crew and 1 stowaway. Observing that the boat was still not full, the multi-millionaire Colonel Astor asked Lightoller if he might join his wife in the lifeboat, but permission was refused. Forever the gentleman, Astor did not argue, and stood back as his young bride disappeared into the darkness below, and he did not survive. So terrible. Finally, attention turned to collapsible boat D, lowered on davits on the port side, virtually full, with 46 people. By the time it was launched at 2:05 a.m., the Titanic's forecastle was completely submerged, water lapping around B deck further aft than the ship's stern, noticeably beginning to lift out the sea. The only boats remaining now were the 2 collapsibles, A and B, on the roof of the officers' accommodation at the base of the forefunnel. As the officers and crew members struggled to release these, the ship began to sink rapidly beneath them. Both floated off as a tide of water washed around and over the bridge, neither of them properly rigged. Boat B ended up being inverted, but still 30 men managed to climb onto the upturned hull, while 20 swam to Boat A, which had enough buoyancy to float even though the canvas screens hadn't been erected. Here we have the crew members knowing that they're doomed when the water enters the boiler room, and lifeboats leaving the stricken liner from the film Titanic in 1953. Although it was in its final death throes, although the captain relieved them of their duties sometime earlier, the 2 radio operators stayed at their posts until the last possible moment. Phillips was still trying to transmit up to 2:17 a.m., only minutes before the ship sank. Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the richest passengers, watched the women and children get away in the boats, and then he returned in his finery. I think that's in the 1997 James Cameron version, coming back in his best to await the end. But here is some pictures taken by a passenger on the Carpathia that rescued survivors, and it was reported in the Sphere on the 4th of May 1912. Here's a Titanic lifeboat you can see this is one of the collapsible boats here with the canvas sidings. There they are, rolled up on the side of the Carpathia and being waited on by passengers. Boatload of women and children, fixing a rope ladder to bring them on board. On the afterdeck, Catholic priest Thomas Barnes was hearing confessions. Now this gentleman actually just the other day, there's a town near me called Ongar, and the Presbyterian House has a blue plaque in honour of this man, who I believe his congregation was in Ongar, but he is, of course, known who gave absolution and heard confessions as the ship sank. In the first-class saloon, a foursome made up of Major Archie Butt and three friends played cards until well after 2 o'clock. Thomas Andrews, the Highland and Wolf managing director, sat in the first-class smoking room staring at a painting on the wall and wasn't seen again. On the bridge, the captain was at his post, engulfed by the rising sea. All the time, the ship's musicians played on, but as the bow began to slip under the waves, they stopped their cheerful ragtime music that lent such an air of unreality to the occasion, and struck up with the traditional hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee. Several survivors attest that their last piece was also another hymn, Autumn, but the former was known to be a favourite of the band leader, Hartley, so it's more probable rendition to have been played at this poignant moment. As the bow went under, the ship began to tilt down rapidly, the stern rising into the air, spilling people into the sea, while at the same moment the ship's lights suddenly went out, after having burnt brightly through the night thanks to the efforts of a dedicated band of engineers, who kept up enough steam to drive the generators. As the ship was dragged down by its flooded forward section, the hull rose almost vertically, the fore funnel breaking off and falling amongst swimmers in the water. She hung in that altitude for several seconds before commencing the plunge to the ocean floor, over 12,000 feet below. As the mighty vessel finally went down, it was accompanied by a rising crescendo of noise as furniture and fittings crashed about inside the hull, coal shifted in the bunkers, hot boilers split and exploded on contact with the ice-cold water. But suddenly, all was silent. The ship had disappeared forever, taking with it over 1,000 people, leaving others drowning in its ice-cold wake, and all that was left were the lifeboats, bobbing in the gradually settling waves, floating in a scene of Arctic desolation lit only by the stars in the clear sky above. The time was 2:20 a.m., 2 hours and 40 minutes from the time that the iceberg ripped into the Titanic's hull. And here we have a handwritten sworn statement by Alfred Omont explaining how he escaped from the Titanic. I am a cotton agent at Havre. I joined the Titanic at Cherbourg on the 10th of April as a first-class passenger. We had good weather all the way till the disaster, and at the time of the disaster. On Sunday the 14th of April, so far as I know, there was no boat drill. I'm practically sure. The captain was in the saloon at dinner on Sunday night the 14th of April. Afterwards, after dinner, there was the orchestra in the companionway, and the captain was there. This was on the D deck. The A deck was on the first deck down from the top deck, and Monsieur Maréchal remarked to me that the captain was with a party and seemed very happy and very confident in his boat. Then he went and played bridge in the Café Parisien. We played on until about 11:40 p.m, and then there was a shock. I have crossed the Atlantic 13 times, and the shock was not a great one. I thought it was caused by a wave. After about a few minutes, I asked the waiter to put down the porthole, and he did so, and we saw nothing. When the shock had happened, we saw something white through the porthole, and we saw water on the ports. When the waiter opened the porthole, we saw nothing except a clear night. About a minute after the waiter had opened the porthole, we all left the cafe. Maréchal put the cards in his jacket, and so did I. I went all round to find my friends to go on with the game. We waited a very long time, and everyone told us there was nothing at all. About 12:30 we saw the captain and the first officer going up to the bridge, and all around about 50 or 60 women and men were waiting anxiously to know what was happening. The captain came down with the first officer. The captain was chewing a toothpick, and he said, "You'd better put your life preservers on as a precaution." Then I went down to my cabin a few floors down, and I put my lifebelt on. Then I went and put on my overcoat, because it was so cold. Then I came up and put on my lifebelt again. I was then on the boat deck, and I saw them get down some boats. While I was still on the boat deck, a boat was let down. The first officer saw me, and I asked if I wanted to get in. Some of the passengers shouted to me not to get in, as they had such confidence in the ship. I saw that the sea was very calm, and on calm reason I thought it was better to jump into the boat and see what would happen. I jumped 2 or 3 yards and landed in the boat anyhow. We were 29 in the boat. The boat could not have held more than 30 in any case. I personally consider and state idea of putting 60 people in a boat or on a raft is ridiculous. I have a photograph in my possession which shows how ridiculous it is to attempt to put 50 or 60 persons in one of these boats or rafts. I consider it a monstrosity to state that one could put 60 persons in a boat in safety. When we were being lowered, about 125 yards from the sea, a man put one rope much lower than the other one, and we all nearly went over. Then we went down and touched water, and it was difficult to get free, and we had to cut the rope to get free. When we were in the water, we started to row away from the ship. I was rowing. We had about 22 women on board. Marshall, my friend, was on board, and I did not recognize him till the morning. We rowed up to about 130 yards from the ship. We saw the ship sink gradually. She sank to starboard. We had no lights in our lifeboat, no compass, no chart, but we had a small cask of water, and I heard that we had a small box of biscuits. After the ship had gone down and before, we saw a light far off, about 8 or 10 miles. Everybody thought it was another ship, a sailing or steamboat. We saw it plainly. We all cheered up, thinking we were going to be saved. We saw it gradually disappear. We thought it was either a sailing boat that could not move on account of the very calm weather, or else an optical illusion on our part. Then we waited until dawn. Then the Carpathia came up. We were royally treated on board the Carpathia. Any man who was saved by the Carpathia will always have his own mind the faces of the captain and the officers. I know personally how much the captain of the Carpathia had at heart to save the Titanic. One of the lookout men was in our boat. He told us that he'd seen the iceberg about 3 minutes before the shock. I am no sailor, but if he did so, we must take into consideration that the ship was going 20 miles an hour at least. So he saw the iceberg 1,760 yards and advised it before meeting it. I consider as a passenger that 2 people knew that the icebergs were around us. These 2 are the head of the company and the captain. I ask, how is it that neither of those 2 said a word for the safety of the passengers? We passengers always consider that we have to deliver our own safety to the captain, and therefore have a right to know if our life is properly looked after, and if in case of records for speed, we have to risk it for the benefit of companies. After the disaster, the captain and officers behaved like gentlemen. Well, I've never seen a handwritten account from the event itself before. This other boat that people said they saw is very interesting to me. I think I mentioned earlier that it could be an optical illusion, but I wonder if it was a ship that wasn't supposed to be there, maybe a military vessel or something, and they snuck off. We are now on to the aftermath. We have 2 gentlemen here by their bicycles. So these gentlemen are nearest the hedge, James Ellsbury, one of the very few third-class passengers to survive. This is the registration document that the British ship owners were required by law to complete and deliver to the customs officers of the port to which the vessel is registered. In Titanic's case, this was Liverpool, where the head office of the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited was based. In return, the customs officers issued a certificate of registry, copied also to the Registrar General of Shipping and Seamen, which gave the ship's unique official number, 131,428. This is a copy. The original certificate went down in the sinking. So much of the controversy surrounding the sinking of the Titanic focused on the actions of other ships in the vicinity. Mention has been made of these lights seen by both passengers and crew, but the vessel concerned has never been positively identified, if indeed there actually was one. And that the lights observed weren't stars, a mistake that's been made on many other occasions, even by experienced observers. One possible candidate was the 506 great-ton Norwegian sailing bark Samson, whose chief officer made a sworn statement in 1962, shortly before his death. He stated that he had seen the Titanic's distress rockets, but that the bark had altered course and sailed away, as he had previously been engaged in an illegal sealing expedition off the Canadian coast, and feared that the rockets were a signal to heave so that she could be boarded and inspected. This story could be true, but there is no other corroborative evidence. Official records show the ship to be in Icelandic waters at the time. I suppose if they're doing something illegal, they're not supposed to be there, like I said before, then I suppose records would show that. It's known that a Massachusetts fishing schooner, the Dorothy Baird, was somewhere near the scene of the sinking, but it can't be established that she was actually within visual range on the night in question. And neither of these vessels carried a radio. Their small size would have limited the number of survivors that they could have rescued anyway. The ship caught up in the backlash, and the desire to find a scapegoat was the cargo liner Californian and her unfortunate captain Stanley Lord. The 6,223 Great Ton steamer was launched in 1901, owned by the Leyland Line, so one of the many taken over by IMM, who also owned White Star and the Titanic. She'd sailed from Liverpool on April the 5th, carrying a general cargo to Boston. By noon on the fateful April 14th, was at that position of 4205, 4725 west, in view of the ice warnings received by the radio operator. Captain Lord decided to alter course to pass slightly south, but despite this, large icebergs were spotted at 6:30, still south of the ship. This information was passed by radio to another Leyland, the Antillean, at 7:30. The Californian's radio operator, Sir Evans, subsequently established that the signal had been picked up by the Titanic. Concerned about the proximity of the ice field, Lord stationed himself on the bridge and doubled his lookouts. At 10:15 he ordered the ship to stop when a glow in the darkness ahead was interpreted as a possible ice field, and decided to heave to for the night, the position being recorded in the log at 4205 north, 57 west. If Boxall's estimate of the Titanic position was correct, then the Californian had stopped at a point just under 20 miles north-northeast from where the tragedy was to occur. At around 10:30 the masthead lights of a ship approaching from the east were seen. Lord checked with his wireless operator to see if he was aware of any other ships. On being told that the only known vessel was the Titanic, he ordered Evans to advise the latter that the Californian was stationary in an ice field, although, as we've seen, this message was brushed aside by the recipient's operators. Having been on continuous duty since 7 a.m. that morning, Evans shut down his radio, went off duty. As there was no requirement at that time, the ship should maintain a continuous listening watch. An hour later, the other vessel appeared to be passing some 5 miles to the south. Third Officer Groves attempted to establish contact by signal lamp, but no answer was forthcoming. And over half an hour later, just after midnight, the Second Officer Stone thought that he saw the lights of another ship, this time heading east. No contact again was established. Shortly afterwards, Captain Lord retired to the chart room for a rest, leaving orders that he was to be called if anything unusual occurred. Between 12:45 and 1:15 a.m, Stone observed what he took to be signal rockets in the distance, in line with the vessel that they'd previously seen, which now appeared to be stationary. Although his report indicated that he didn't consider that the lights actually came from the vessel he could see. After observing the rockets, he called down the voice pipe to the captain, who requested to be kept informed of any developments. Subsequently, James Gibson, a young cadet, was sent down to report that more rockets had been fired, and the stationary vessel had disappeared. However, Lord doesn't seem to have been fully awake, and the cadet was obviously apprehensive at disturbing his stern captain, and retired, after an inconclusive exchange. Oh dear. This was at odds with the account given by a fireman, Ernest Gill, who claimed that he'd come on deck at midnight after 4 hours on duty and saw a very large steamer passing about 10 miles away off the starboard side. Went below but returned to the deck 30 minutes later when he saw 2 white rockets within the space of a few minutes, again off to starboard. He didn't notify the bridge of these sightings, nor did he see any Morse lamp signals from any other ship, nor hear any other noises, such as the concussion from the exploding rockets. This is the discharge book from the Titanic crew survivor Percival Albert Blake. It shows that the surviving crew members were only paid until the ship sank. It also shows that Percival Blake served on Titanic's sister ship Olympic as a trimmer on the transatlantic run. That's outrageous, isn't it? We're not going to pay you anymore because the ship sank. Doesn't matter what you went through. The night passed. The crew of the Californian was blissfully unaware of the drama. And then when daylight came, Captain Law returned to the bridge to see if passage through the ice was possible. His attention was drawn to a 4-masted vessel with a yellow funnel off to the south-southeast. This was thought to have been the one that fired rockets during the night. Concerned that it might need assistance, it roused his radio operator and ordered him to raise the other ship. So, as Evans tuned his equipment and transmitted a standard CQ message. He was startled to receive a reply from Frankfurt, a 7,431 great-ton German liner, asking if they were aware that the Titanic had struck an iceberg and sunk during the night. This was followed by confirmation from the Virginian, a 10,757 Great British ship, which also passed the all-important position of the sinking. Lord and his chief officer plotted on this on their charts, realizing as they did so that they were very close to the sinking and probably able to assist with the search for survivors. He ordered the ship immediately to get underway, the time being now 5:30 a.m, and pushed cautiously through the ice at 6 knots before reaching open water on the west side, and pushing southwards at the maximum speed of 13 knots. After another hour she passed the Canadian Pacific liner Mount Temple, which lay stopped at the reported position of the sinking, although there were no wreckage or survivors to be seen. The Californian eventually sighted the Cunard liner Carpathia to the southeast on the other side of the ice field, and learned by wireless that the latter was at the actual position of the sinking, and was even then picking up survivors. They eventually came together at 8:30 a.m, indicating that the Californian must have been at least 25 miles from the scene when the Titanic sank. So although Captain Lord became something of a scapegoat, his was not the only ship within visual range. The Canadian Pacific liner Mount Temple, under the command of Captain James Moore, was sailing from Antwerp to New York and was 49 miles southwest when it picked up the first distress signals. Captain Moore immediately altered course to the northeast, but he began to encounter ice and suddenly had to put his engines in reverse and turn hard to port in order to avoid a collision with the schooner sighted just ahead. After the incident, he continued cautiously forward, stopping occasionally, before reaching the reported position of the Titanic at 4:30. No wreckage of lifeboats was seen. The captain later stated that no signals or rockets had been observed, although an unidentified tramp steamer had been observed steaming on a similar course for some time. When daylight came, he continued searching until 9 a.m, when he became aware that the survivors had been rescued. It will be remembered that the Mount Temple was sighted by the Californian. She headed towards the area of the sinking during the early hours of the 15th, which would indicate that the Mount Temple had actually been much closer to the sinking than the latter. Despite her captain's assertions, at least 2 people, 1 passenger and 1 ship's officer on the Mount Temple, made statements to the effect that the Titanic's lights and signals had indeed been sighted, but that the Mount Temple stood off and made no attempt to move closer until well after daybreak. For some reason, the account and actions of Captain Moore were never seriously challenged, and he avoided the destructive publicity directed at Captain Lord. Despite this, the Carpathia had been a shining example of efficiency and properly directed action, which had resulted in her being the only ship to arrive in time to pick up the living survivors. The credit for this rested entirely with her captain, Arthur Rostron, who had joined the Cunard line in 1895 and rose to his first command in 1907, taking over the Carpathia in 1912. The ship left New York at noon on April 11th with 743 passengers, fortunately only a fraction of her designed accommodation for around 2,200, bound for Gibraltar and then on to other Mediterranean ports. On the fateful Sunday, the Carpathia's only radio operator, 21-year-old Harold Cotton, had been on duty continuously since 7 a.m. that morning, and as midnight approached he was preparing to close down his radio and retire to bed. While undressing, he kept his headphones on, listening out for a reply to an earlier communication which he had addressed to the liner Parisian, although this was not forthcoming. While he waited, he idly returned to the Cape Cod frequency and heard several messages addressed to the Titanic, which he noted down with the intention of passing them on when the opportunity occurred. He then continued his preparations for bed, when on an impulse he decided to see if he could raise the liner himself. This was almost 12:30 a.m. This message to the Titanic was phrased in the jargon favoured by radio operators of the day, using the Carpathia's call sign MPA. He started tapping his Morse key. "I say, old man, do you know there is a batch of messages coming through for you from MCC, the code for Cape Cod?" Even before he finished, the Titanic broke in with an electrifying message of her own. "MGY, come at once, we have struck an iceberg, it's CQD, old man, position 4146 north, 5014W. Cotton quickly ascertained that this was a genuine message and dashed half-dressed to the bridge to report the exchange to the first officer, who immediately conducted him down to the captain's cabin where Rostron had just retired for the night. Instantly wide awake, the latter rushed up to the chart room and quickly determined that his ship was some 58 miles southeast of the Titanic's reported position. His actions asked the mariner, who knew his trade inside out and needed no prompting to do what was necessary. As the Carpathia swung around on a course of 308 degrees to close to the Titanic, he ordered the ship's 18 lifeboats to be prepared and swung out while the chief engineer was asked to raise maximum steam, shutting down much ancillary machinery and heating systems. As a result of the Herculean efforts of the stokers, the Carpathia eventually worked up to a speed of 17.5 knots, a speed that doesn't sound impressive until it realised that the ship's design maximum speed under favourable conditions was only 14.5. As the hull quivered under the strain, the entire crew was briefed to prepare to receive survivors, but not before every man was served with a hot drink to fortify them for the work ahead. Passengers were asked to remain calm, to not hinder the crew. They cleared spaces, piled up blankets, made the boats ready. Hot soup and drinks were prepared. To accommodate people from the Titanic, one of the 3 doctors aboard were alerted and made their own preparations. Wow. As it told through the night, additional lookouts were posted, and the radio transmitter was listening to the Titanic's increasingly desperate radio transmissions, each of which was relayed to his captain by a steward acting as a messenger. The last one received at 1:45, stating, "Engine room full up to the boilers." Only 45 minutes later, a green flare was sighted in the distance far ahead. This, it transpired, had been fired by Boxall from lifeboat number 2. Rostron ordered rockets to be fired at 15-minute intervals so that any survivors would know that rescue was approaching, although it was nearly another hour before it reached its position of the sinking, and no boats or wreckage had been spotted. I mean, this is chilling, this account, isn't it? Because you just think that if this boat was within 20 miles away, if this boat was closer, if this boat had been where the Californian was, this story could have ended up being very different. There was occasional groups of green light low in the water, and these eventually turned out to be the lifeboats. At 4 a.m, just before dawn broke, Captain Rostron ordered the engines to stop, and the Carpathia drifted to a halt only a few hundred yards from Boxall's boat. 10 minutes later it lay under the Carpathia's starboard side, and the work of getting the 25 occupants began. On board, Boxall himself, still suffering from exposure to the cold and from shock, was taken to the bridge, where he was able to give a brief account of what happened, confirming to the disbelieving listeners that the Titanic had indeed been lost. As the thin daylight began to illuminate the scene, the scale and nature of the catastrophe slowly became apparent. The Titanic's lifeboats with their pitiful survivors rode the barely disturbed sea, while the whole area was strewn with icebergs of all shapes and sizes, the largest towering more than 200 feet above the water. The calm conditions meant the lifeboats remained together, mostly contained within an area of 4 or 5 square miles, but manoeuvring a large ship among the ice floes without crushing or overturning small boats was extremely difficult, and taxed Captain Rostron's skills to the limit. This took several hours. It wasn't until 8 a.m. that the last boat was located and brought alongside, number 12, which by now contained more than 70 people, as survivors from the overturned collapsible B had been transferred to it, as well from collapsible D. The exhausted second officer Lytle, and now the senior surviving officer from the Titanic, came on board, and it was none too soon, as already the calm weather that characterised the night was beginning to break, and the sea, whipped up by a freshening wind, made the rescue of the last survivors extremely difficult. Rostron ordered the Titanic's lifeboats to be hoisted aboard, and handed over the search for further survivors to Captain Lord and the Californian, which had now arrived on the scene. Before leaving the area, a brief but emotional service for those lost in the disaster was held in Carpathia's first-class saloon as the ship passed over the spot where the Titanic was assumed to have sunk. By 8:50, the ship was underway, returning to New York to land the survivors, but it took the Cunard ship several hours to get free of the great ice pack that had been the cause of the tragedy. The heart-rending task of counting and identifying the survivors then began, the eventual tally reaching 705. 201 first class, 118 second class, and 179 third class passengers, together with 207 crew. So while there's no doubt that Captain Rostron saved all those who were alive in the boats when he reached the area, it nevertheless began to dawn on all involved that more than twice this number, but some 1,523 souls, must have perished when the ship went down. Most surviving passengers were women, and their grief as they began to realise that they'd lost their husbands or fathers or relatives was heart-rending. The crew and passengers of the Carpathia rallied around to do what they could, regardless of their class or status. This is the electronic message from the Titanic that was received, and here's asking for further assistance at about 1:40 a.m. We are sinking fast, passengers being put into boats. So as we know, one of the survivors was Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman, who at Rostron's suggestion composed a message to be sent to his company's officers in New York advising them of the sinking. It was dispatched during the morning of the 15th and read, "Deeply regret to advise you Titanic sank this morning after collision with iceberg, resulting in serious loss of life. Full particulars later, Ismay." And this was addressed to P.A. Franklin. Could you imagine receiving that? You're like, what? What on earth? Following on from this, preparations were made to transmit the long lists of survivors' names, but it was too great for Cotton, the Carpathia's radio operator, who'd been on continuous duty for over 24 hours and was on the point of collapse. But one of Titanic's operators, Harold Bride, had been picked up, and though he had frostbite and exposure, gamely volunteered to assist and was carried up to the radio room, where he spent the rest of the voyage. This is Thomas Perth, the 29-year-old managing director of the Pierce Soap Company. Married for just 18 months, he was travelling first class with his wife to look at a proposed new site for the company's first American venture. He lost his life in the disaster. This is a second communication from the White Star Line to the Board of Trade, correcting the previous day's telegram and admitting to the dreadful news that the Titanic had sunk with great loss of life. A footnote to this stage of the drama is pleasing to be able to record that the efforts of Captain Rostron and his crew were duly recognised. Even while still aboard the Carpathia, survivors on the Titanic organised a committee to raise a fund to express their gratitude, which amounted to some $15,000. This was used as a distribution of cash to all members of the Carpathia's crew, and when the ship returned to New York some 6 weeks later, the opportunity was taken to present Captain Rostron with a specially commissioned silver loving cup, while the crew all received specially struck commemorative medals. The management of the Cunard Line nobly refused to accept any payment for the services rendered by their ship, and indeed added to the rewards bestowed on the crew by giving an extra month's wages to all those who had been aboard at the time. Well, there's a bit of respect there. This was Edith Pears, the wife of Thomas, who was 22-year-old. She was rescued in a lifeboat and went on to drive ambulances during the First World War before her eventual remarriage. This is union and employer relations at this time weren't great, and the Titanic disaster made matters worse, as this letter shows. So at the heart of this indisputable fact that more people were rescued from first and second class than from third and crew, and this is a clue ascribed to class prejudice by Ben Tillett, one of the leaders of the Dock, Wharf, Riverside and General Workers Union, who organised the London dock strike of 1889. There's a little bit of it here. The union offers its sincere condolences to the bereaved relatives of the third-class passengers of the SS Titanic, whose tragic sinking we deplore. We also send our sincere regret to the relatives of the crew who were drowned. We also offer our strongest protest against the wanton and callous disregard of human life and the vicious class antagonism shown in the practical forbidding of the saving of the lives of third-class passengers. The refusal to permit other than first-class passengers to be saved by the boats is, in our opinion, a disgrace to our common civilization. I mean, it is. The survivors of the Titanic's crew were less fortunate. For a start, the cash-strapped White Star Line stopped their wages from the moment the ship sank. This was standard practice at the time, but its application in these circumstances seemed particularly harsh. Most were transferred immediately to the Lapland, a ship belonging to the Red Star Line, for the journey back to Plymouth, England. 4 officers and over 30 crew were subpoenaed to appear before an American committee of investigation, some actually being taken off the Lapland shortly after she'd sailed. And as the news of the sinking spread across both sides of the Atlantic, there was shock and grief over the great loss of life, and bewilderment as to why such a tragedy could have happened. Then, as would happen today, there was immense public interest and speculation over the train of events, and an unconscious desire to find a scapegoat. The vested interests of maritime trade in general, and the White Star Line in particular, were less than pleased that some of their alleged shortcomings should be aired in public. There were 2 full-scale inquiries, one in Britain, held under the auspices of the Board of Trade, and the other in America, under the chairmanship of Senator William Smith. At first, the British authorities resented any idea that the Americans had any right to carry out an inquiry, as it concerned a British registered ship, owned by a British company, flying the British flag, and manned by a British crew. However, the Americans gave little credence to such niceties, pointing out that the White Star Line was in fact itself owned by an American company, and that many American citizens had died when the ship went down. Senator Smith was an energetic politician with an eye on the main chance and saw an opportunity to make a name for himself, to the extent that the official inquiry was conducted almost entirely by himself and in a full blaze of publicity. To British eyes, the Americans were brash and erratic and didn't know how to conduct a formal investigation. Be that as it may, the inquiry took place over 17 days between April the 19th and May 25th in New York and Washington. It elicited much significant information that was fresh in the minds of many witnesses called. There were no less than 82 witnesses called, both from passengers and crew, the most significant being the ship's officers and some of the crew members, principally the lookouts and radio operator. In addition, Bruce Ismay was given a very hard time as Smith attempted to prove negligence on the part of IMM, the White Star Line's owners. Also of significance were the 3 witnesses from the Californian, including Captain Lord, who gave a factual account of the night's happenings from his point of view, while his fireman Barrett repeated his statement that he'd seen a large ship and rockets being fired close to his own. In addition, the radio operator Sir Eleven said that his captain had been informed 3 times about the rockets. The recommendations came only 3 days after the proceedings had ended. As well as setting out a narrative of the event, they spotlighted the lack of lifeboat capacity, as well as problems experienced in loading and lowering them. There was a detailed description of messaging sent, from obvious improvements in the recommendations to the provision and equipping of lifeboats, through regulations to be applied in the manning and operation of maritime radio stations, to rules on the use of pyrotechnics at sea, and substantial improvements in the design and construction of commercial vessels. The report highlighted in favourable terms the actions of Captain Rostron, and Senator Smith subsequently asked that legislation be enacted to allow the striking of a commemorative medal that would be presented to the captain by the President of the United States. It did also contain criticism of the way lifeboats had been handled and loaded aboard the Titanic, and the professional conduct of Captain Smith, who is said to have acted negligently in proceeding at speed through a known ice field. Well, the British government itself did not escape censure for failing to ensure that adequate provision was made for a potential disaster on this scale. The results weren't naturally well received with pleasure in the UK, but one finding was eventually echoed and accepted. This concerned Captain Lord of the Californian, who was roundly condemned for his apparent inactivity, and was held to be grossly negligent. It was strongly hinted that if he'd heeded what was assumed to be unambiguous distress signals from the Titanic, his ship could have reached the scene before the liner sank, and rescued far more people than were in the lifeboats. The British Board of Trade formal investigation into the loss of the steamship Titanic began on May 2nd, 1912, while the American inquiry was still in progress. It was held rather incongruously in the drill hall of the London Scottish Regiment, not far from Buckingham Palace, under the direction of Lord Mersey, otherwise known as Mr. Justice Bingham, Baron Mersey of Toxteth, Lancashire. Other members of the Board of Inquiry, known as assessors, included experts in naval architecture and marine engineering, as well as professional seamen. So, on the right here, this question was put by Josiah Wedgwood, the Liberal MP for Newcastle-under-Lyme, to the President of the Board of Trade, and he asks why more children died in third class than in the rest of the ship. In fact, all the children travelling in first and second were saved, while only 34.62% of children in third were spared from drowning. That is horrible. And over here, the death certificate for passengers travelling first class. In the first column is the date of the disaster, the second gives the place, and the third column starts the alphabetical list of passengers who died. The next gives their sex, almost exclusively men, and then the completed column gives nationality, address, cause of death, unanimously by drowning. A large number of wealthy and important people died. John Jacob Astor, one of the wealthiest men in the world, Isidore Straus, the founder of Macy's department store, and the designer of the Titanic, Thomas Andrews. Here we have the death certificates for travellers in second class. They're much the same as the first, but this time only some of their ages are given. This is Percy Andrew Bailey, apprenticed to a butcher in his hometown of Penzance in Cornwall. At 18, he had obtained a position in Akron, Ohio, and purchased a second-class ticket on the Titanic. Unfortunately, died in the disaster. This is Edith Peacock. And Charles Joseph Shawnee came from Sussex. Travelling third class, he was returning to his fiancée to open a taxi cab company. He was taking much of his family's silverware for him, which he hoped to get a better price than at home, and lost his life in the sinking. It's fascinating to put actual faces. So here she is, Edith Niall Peacock, put third class tickets for herself, 3-year-old daughter Tristel, and 7-month-old baby Alfred. Her husband Benjamin was never even to see his new son, as Edith and both children lost their lives. That's so hard for me to read, that's so painful. Here is the third class death certificates. Scandinavian names making up a large number of them. 62% of third class passengers were drowned, whereas 62 were saved in first class. This is a letter sent by Sir Edward Grey from the British Embassy in Washington to London, reporting on the findings of the Senate Committee into the Titanic disaster. The head of the investigation was William Alden Smith, Senator from Michigan, empowered to look into the matter despite Titanic being a British ship. So this meant that they could be sued under American law if negligence could be proved. Smith's motives are questionable, but he did point the finger of blame at the Board of Trade's inspector for hurrying his inspection during Titanic's trials. Captain Smith for ignoring the presence of ice, actions of the captain of the California, and the inadequate number, boarding, and launching of the lifeboats. And the letter quotes the final remarks that Senator Smith would make in his speech to the Senate on the disaster. We shall leave to the honest judgment of England its painstaking chastisement of the Board of Trade, to whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality. Both Bruce Ismay and Sir Cosmo Dove Gordon were found not to have acted improperly, and once again, Captain Rostron of the Carpathia was praised for his actions in the British inquiry. And although the inquiry was by no means a court of law, it effectively found Captain Lord of the Californian guilty of gross negligence, implied that he was directly responsible for the loss of the many souls, which it was alleged he could have rescued. So a little retrospect here and an image of the ship under the sea. That was one of its magnesium bronze wing propellers and moved on the seabed 12,000 feet below. Percival Albert Blake on the second from left here, with unknown survivors. So the landing of the Titanic survivors in New York and the ensuing American-British hearings were by no means the end of the story. They were the opening pages of a story that's steadfastly refused to die and has become a part of 20th century legend. Legal activity continued, claims made against them. The wreck of the Titanic lay at the depth of the ocean, and tentative plans to salvage it were laid in the aftermath but came to naught because of the technology of the time. The war breaking out in 1914 meant Titanic fade from prominence because other great ships became victims of the conflict. The Lusitania sunk off the Irish coast by a German U-boat, the Titanic sister ship the Britannic serving as a hospital ship, and the scale of the Titanic's losses understandably began to fade in public memory. Of course not for families who lost their loved ones. This is Michael Navratil's grave in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the Mount Olive Sabbath Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So this is detailing the operation to find the Titanic, which had taken a considerable amount of time. And Melvina Dean was the youngest Titanic survivor. She was just 9 weeks old, oh my word, at the time of the tragedy, seen here with her mother and brother Bertram Vere Dean. 9 weeks old at that freezing cold temperature. It's unbelievable to think that they survived. Here is Eva Hart, Melvina Dean, and Edith Haseman at the British Titanic Society's convention in 1995. And the rift between Thomas Ryan and the Asiatic Steam Navigation Company. The particulars of the negligence were that they navigated the said ship at an excessive speed and at an improper speed in view of the conditions that prevailing, namely the exceptional darkness of the night, the hazy conditions of the atmosphere, the absence of wind and the movement of sea, and immediately preceded in time of the collision and presence of icebergs and fields of ice in the course of said vessel, that while knowing of the presence of the said field they failed to alter their course or diminish their speed, as so to avoid the same, and failed to provide a sufficient and proper lookout therefore, and to supply lookout men with binoculars, that no adequate lifeboat accommodation was provided on the said ship, having regard to the number of passengers and crew she was then carrying, and that the defendants failed to have said crews sufficiently drilled and organised for the work of manning, filling, and launching such lifeboats. And the statement of claim here. A scramble to deny responsibility for the loss of the Titanic was carried out at the highest levels in both London and Washington, so there was no general compensation paid out. Tickets issued by the White Star Line for Titanic were not in line with the Board of Trade requirements, but they still held good in the courts. On the back, each ticket stated that the owners would not be liable for any loss or damage caused by the negligent navigation of the vessel by the company or its servants. This is the written judgment on the claim, poured in the High Court of Justice between Thomas Ryan, the father of a victim, and the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited. Patrick Ryan and James Moran both drowned in the disaster, and their families united to sue the owners for negligence based on the findings of the Commission of Inquiry. The judge awarded in favour of the plaintiffs. The company appealed, but the verdict was upheld. So it should be. This is a scene from Raise the Titanic, a film. And with regular publication of films and books on the subject, there's little doubt that the drama of the Titanic will continue to weave a powerful spell for generations to come. The ship itself is gradually deteriorating, and by the middle of the 21st century may no longer be a recognisable shape on the seabed, but the image of the great liner sinking slowly into the sea on that starry April night with its lights blazing and the band playing will be forever etched on the face of maritime history, and the whole scene will be instantly replayed in people's minds by the mention of a single word: Titanic. And there we have the end of this wonderful account. It's fascinating, isn't it? This book has been published in, let's take a look, shall we? When was this book published? Because that last paragraph there will captivate people for years to come. It's a fascinating one. It was first edition published in 1997, so actually just as the film Titanic was about to come out, the James Cameron version. And of course to this day, it does continue to captivate, as we well know. Thank you so much for joining me for this exploration of the Titanic, its life